Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you joining us today. My name is David Mainville. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Navvia. I have, just by way of introduction, I have a fairly extensive background in service management, business process management, digital transformation, and also cybersecurity. So I'm going to try and bring that background of mine to bear on this presentation on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Before we get starting, for those of you who are not familiar with Navvia, Navvia has been in business since 1999. We've always focused on helping organizations assess, design, and implement their processes, IT and business processes. We have a SaaS application that allows you to do those things. If you'd like to learn more about that application, you can go to our website, navvia.com, and reach out through the contact us or request a demo option, and we'd be happy to provide more information. So the learning objectives for today's session include, number one, understanding the NIST CSF 2.0 framework. So we're going to look at the reason that the NIST came about, the structure of the NIST, how it applies to different parts of the organization, the infrastructure, different sectors, and how it can actually apply to organizations of all sizes. We're also going to look at how to translate cybersecurity outcomes, basically those defined by the NIST framework, into operational resilience. So learn how this ability to drive operational resilience will support continuity, governance, and risk management. We're also going to tie the NIST outcomes from the CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework, to IT process maturity, because in order to achieve those outcomes, you need the right processes in place. So we're going to link that to the cybersecurity framework with IT service management and various ways of measuring the capability and maturity of your processes. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how to integrate the cybersecurity framework into your organization and how you could use it to communicate cybersecurity strategy to the various stakeholders and executive management within your organization. But before we do that, let's start with the why. Why is something like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework so important? Well, it's all about operational resilience. Looking at operational resilience, it's the ability of an organization to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disruptions, including cyber incidents, while maintaining delivery of critical services. Now, I want to point out, I mean, we're talking here today about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, but that's just one part of operational resilience. I mean, a major outage that's not cybersecurity related impacts operational resilience as much as a cybersecurity incident. So the things that you do as part of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework also beefs up overall operational resilience because it requires you to look at a lot of the processes within your organization. So not only are you better from a cybersecurity perspective, but you're also better from an overall operational resilience perspective. So some of the attributes of operational resilience, it helps you protect critical business operations. So basically you can stay on the air. It helps you enhance risk management and decision-making. If you have a good operational resilience framework, you understand the threats that you're facing and you have the right information to make the correct decisions to protect yourself from those threats and to mitigate them when they do occur. It helps you ensure regulatory compliance and reduces legal exposure. You know, a part of operational resilience is maintaining a viable business. And you could see by some of the high profile incidents that have occurred over the last year or two, cybersecurity threats can result in heavy fines and also basically lawsuits that can really put your organization at serious risk. Operational resilience also helps you mitigate the risk of regulatory fines and reduces costs from cyber incidents. And it helps you build a competitive advantage through trust and reliability. You know, there's some, as I said before, there's been some very high profile cybersecurity incidents in the past. And when one of those occur, it really has people thinking twice of whether they should continue to do business with you. So you can really gain a competitive advantage by maintaining a very robust infrastructure and a very resilient infrastructure. Now, to achieve operation resilience, it's really requires a combination of people, process, and technology. You know, I say this time and time again, too many organizations rely on tools. Oh, we have operational resilience, we have a failover, or we have automated backups. But if the people are not governing the technology, if the processes aren't in place to ensure that all aspects of the infrastructure are being backed up or protected, you're going to have holes. So without a combination of people, process, and technology, you're never going to achieve true operational resilience. So to get there, I think it's very important to build a foundation. And that foundation starts with cybersecurity practices. You tie that in with your ITSM processes, and together that really gives you this framework where you can build your operational resilience on that cybersecurity practice and mature ITSM processes. Again, too many people look at cybersecurity as a checklist. You know, do we have these policies in place? Do we have these controls in place? Policies and controls, you know, policies, they can sit on a shelf and never be implemented. You know, controls are a checklist, and they give you a point in time look at how you're achieving cybersecurity. But it's the processes and the practices that are going to make sure that this is a resilient organization. All right, so operational resilience is the focus here, but we can achieve operational resilience through a combination of processes and cybersecurity practices. And now I'd like to introduce the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So the NIST Cybersecurity Framework provides trusted guidance to help organizations manage and reduce cybersecurity risk. It defines a set of high-level security outcomes. Now, what do I mean by outcomes? I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. But one of the things about the NIST, it doesn't tell you how to do things. It really gives you guidance on what you should be achieving. And there's a difference there, right? Because if you're a small organization, how you achieve something could be very different than a large organization, but you can still achieve that same outcome. So the outcomes are what's important, not how you do it so much. So let's take an example of that. Let's say you have an outcome, and this is directly from the cybersecurity framework, to have your hardware inventories managed and maintained. Now, why is that important? Well, how do you assess risk if you don't know all of the assets that you're trying to protect? How do you mitigate let's say a failure if you don't understand the true inventory and the configuration of what's in place? So the outcome is making sure you have your hardware inventories managed and maintained. But to translate that outcome to action, that's where you need a robust asset management process that includes people, process, and technology. So if you're a large organization, you might have very sophisticated asset management tools. Discovery tools are very, well configured, established CMDB for your asset management and configuration management. If you're a smaller organization and you're doing this in a more manual way, it still works provided you understand all of the pieces of your inventory. So again, an outcome is what you're supposed to achieve. How you implement it is through the processes, people, process, and technology. One of the great things about the NIST CSF is it helps you with a common language for cybersecurity. You know, cybersecurity can be very technical. You know, you have intrusion protection devices, intrusion detection devices. You have, mobile device management systems. You can get really technical with all of the various aspects of cybersecurity. But, you know, some of that is when you're speaking to the legal stakeholders or executive management or other stakeholders within your organization, it sort of flies over their head. So by putting it in a outcome-based language, it provides a common way to discuss cybersecurity risks across the organization. So common language. Now, the other great thing about the NIST, it's globally recognized. It was developed in the US, but it's been adopted across Europe, Asia Pacific, Canada, and beyond. And it's actually been incorporated in many countries' internal cybersecurity practices. It's received broad adoption. So you're seeing the NIST being used in all different industry sectors, whether that's manufacturing or financial services or healthcare, critical infrastructure. Because of that, it's gotten a lot of input. So each of these different sectors can bring something back to the table that actually further helps the NIST evolve. And the NIST actually does evolve over time. It's a living framework. So this broad adoption is great because it helps inform the framework with real life experience. The NIST is very scalable. I mentioned it earlier, because it's outcome based. Any organization can adopt the cybersecurity framework. How you do identity management, how you do asset management, how you do incident management, all of that is very scalable. So from a small organization to a large organization, the goal is to achieve the outcomes, not to tell you how to do it. It's also government backed. It was created under a US executive order, and it's managed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology for credibility and trust. And finally, it's an evolving standard. It's regularly updated to address emerging risks, and it has the ability to respond to new technologies like the Internet of Things, AI, et cetera. It's constantly being evolved to be relevant. Now, when the executive order was signed to develop this framework, it was done in collaboration with industry, academia, government, and international standards organizations. So it really does align with, the ISO standards like 27001 or 27002. It aligns with various enterprise risk management frameworks. So because of all of this broad input, it's a very robust framework. It was first released in 2014 as the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. And the current version was released in 2024 as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2.0, which expanded its scope and its applicability. So some of the key milestones in the NIST framework, the executive order was issued in 2013. So, basically seeing a need to improve the nation's infrastructure from external threats. This executive order was issued, and the best minds were brought together to develop this framework. The first version of the NIST was released in 2014, and it was released under a slightly different name. It was a different name, I should say. It was called Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. So that was in 2014. There was an update in 2018 where they brought some different aspects into the NIST, including authentication and supply chain risk management. And supply chain risk management is extremely important, especially these days when so many organizations are using SaaS applications or third-party suppliers. Your security is only good as their security. So bringing that into the framework was really great. And then in 2024, it was expanded by bringing an aspect of governance to the framework. So not only identifying the outcomes you should achieve, but putting outcomes in place on how you should govern those, the adoption or the attainment of those outcomes. Let's take a look now at some of the core functions in the taxonomy of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about outcomes, because everything in the NIST revolves around outcomes. So what are some of the attributes of an outcome? Well, it needs to be widely understandable. Again, we don't want to get into technical speak. We don't want to get into the weeds. I need to prove your identity before I give you access to a system. That's an outcome, right? How you do that? It can be very sophisticated. It could be manual. But provided you do, validate someone's identity, maybe in a small company, you hire somebody, you do a background check on the person, you do a check on their passport, their work history, their right to work, you do a few other things to validate they are who they say they are, and then you can give them access to the systems. In larger organizations, there might be more sophisticated ways of doing it, especially in large organizations where you may need access to applications and systems in different parts of the organization. You need more robust methods to improve authentication. So it needs to be, again, widely understandable. Everybody needs to know what these outcomes are so that they can work towards achieving them. It has to be adaptable. So it's adaptable to any sector, any country, any technology environment. So within the NIST, it looks at information technology infrastructure. It looks at the Internet of Things, control systems. So those systems that manage critical infrastructure like power stations and pipelines and that sort of thing. It has to be able to apply to the cloud with SaaS applications, and of course, to things like AI. So these outcomes have to make sense across all of these contexts. It also needs to be outcome-driven risk management. So the reason you're looking at things from an outcome perspective is because the executives and management of an organization needs to assess the risks, what they're facing, and they have to have the right protection in place. And the better they understand what those outcomes are, because they're presented in a clear, common language, the better it is, the better the chance they'll be able to put the right things in place to achieve it. If you go to a senior executive with a lot of technical babble, they might not recognize that as a risk, as opposed to presenting it in clear business terms. So outcomes are presented in a way that everyone in the organization can understand, they can internalize, and they can then work together to ensure that everything is protected. In the NIST framework, there's the outcomes are organized in a hierarchy. So it all starts with something called functions. There are 6 functions in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I'll get to those in a moment. But the purpose of the function is a top-level organization. So it helps organize high-level security outcomes to guide risk management. As you'll see the six functions in a moment, you'll also see that they're sort of aligned to different parts of your organization. So it's easy to say, who's responsible for the high-level functions of the NIST. So we got the functions, which is the high-level categories of outcomes. That's broken down into 22 categories across the 6 functions. So those are groups of related outcomes with each function. So if we're talking about asset management, it's all of the outcomes you're trying to achieve from asset management. If you're talking about risk management, it's all of the outcomes you're trying to achieve from risk management, mapped back to the 6 functions. And then there's 106 subcategories. And those subcategories are really those are the outcomes, basically. Those are the detailed, actionable cybersecurity outcomes an organization should try to achieve. So 6 functions, 22 categories, 106 subcategories. Looking at the functions, I'll start with identify. So identify is all about understanding your current risks. So what am I facing? What are the threats out there? How am I going to deal with those threats? How am I going to prioritize those threats? So it's about identifying what I need to be aware of in order to protect it. That segues right into the next one, which is called protect. So protect is all of the safeguards you have in place to protect those assets that you've identified and those threats and those risks that you've identified. So you identify the risks and the assets, and then you put steps in place to protect those assets and protect yourself from those risks. Then you have detect. So once you've identified things and once you put protection in place, you've got to be aware if someone's trying to hack you, if someone's trying to infiltrate your network, if there's ransomware floating around, if there's malware floating around, you've got to be able to detect these things. So this is all of the practices and all of the outcomes required to detect something is trying to infiltrate. Then you have respond. So respond is once you've detected things, it's analyzing it and taking the actions to raise an incident, do your incident response, and make sure that you're able to initiate all of the steps you have to address that incident that's come in. That's followed by recover. So recover basically looks at getting all of the assets and all of the operations affected by a cybersecurity incident back to operational readiness. So it's you've identified, you protected, you detected, you're responding now to any threats, and now you have all of the right practices in place to recover in the event that a cybersecurity incident does occur. And overseeing all of that is govern. So govern is the risk management strategy, it's the expectations, the policies, roles and responsibilities, all of that governance framework to ensure the other 5 functions are being well managed and well maintained. So those are the core functions of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Let's take a look at each one in a little bit more detail. So identify. So understand risks across systems, people, assets, data, and capabilities. So there's 3 categories and 21 subcategories in identify. The 3 categories include understanding and prioritizing the current risks. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can have threat intelligence where, you're subscribed to various services that, that keep you informed of the threat landscape. You can do internal assessments. You can have third-party assessments. So basically understanding the entire risk profile, prioritizing those risks. So, perhaps a risk to your marketing website is not as serious as a risk to your financial systems. So understanding the various risk profiles of all of the assets and systems that you have, prioritizing them, then figuring how you're going to treat those risks, whether or not you want to accept the risk, there's nothing we can really do. I'm just going to accept that risk. Maybe you're going to transfer the risk to a third party, like an insurance company. So we'll take the risk, but we're going to have insurance for it. Perhaps you're going to have mitigation plans. So it's all about understanding, prioritizing the current risk, and putting all the steps in place to address those, to record those, and to track those risks. It's also about identifying critical assets and suppliers. So you can't protect what you don't understand. So you need to go out and look at all of the different assets you have. You need to prioritize those assets. So again, a production server is different than a test server. You also got to look at your third-party suppliers. That could be managed service suppliers. It could be SaaS applications like Salesforce or ServiceNow. Again, a lot of people run their business on those tools, and if those things are impacted by a cybersecurity risk, or your data within those systems are impacted, that could be serious. So understand and prioritize current risks, identify critical assets and suppliers, and then continually improve the whole risk management process. So you've got a risk management process, but you want to make sure that someone is governing that risk management process. So you're staying on top of current risks. You're making sure that risks that have been identified and recorded in your risk register, your risk management system, are being tracked. They're being tracked all the way through to the remediation of the risk. Excuse me. So that's identify. Basically, what's out there, what's important, how important is it, and how do we go about and identify what it is we need to protect ourselves from. So that moves into protect. So these are all the safeguards to protect critical assets and ensure your service delivery. So that has 5 categories and 22 subcategories of outcomes. So the first one is manage access through identity, authentication, and authentication controls. So those are all the things to make sure, the right people have access to the right systems at the right time. This is, separation of duties would fall into something like this. The principle of least access, so that basically you only have access to the data you need to have access to. How do you deal with people when you onboard them and offboard them, or if they change jobs? When they change a role in the organization, you should look at all of their authentication to make sure that they don't have access to systems they no longer need access to. So that's managing basically access right across the infrastructure. That includes physical access as well. Do you have access to the data center or different network rooms? Another part of protect is training people on cybersecurity practices, and that's not that's really twofold, right? So it's the general cybersecurity training, like phishing exercises, making sure people can recognize a bad email, or they don't click on a malicious link, or they don't post things, to an AI that shouldn't be posted to an AI, or they don't put stuff on social media that shouldn't go on social media. So that's the general cybersecurity. But every role in the organization may have specific cybersecurity practices. So, for example, in our organization, the developers need to be trained on cybersecurity practices, basically secure coding practices. Or when we release a change to the application, it's got to go through dynamic and static testing. So basically, how well are your specialists or the people with specialized skills trained, as well as the people with general skills. You also have to be able to safeguard data in storage, transit, and in use. So what kind of encryption you're using, when it's in the database is encrypted, when you do backups, are those backups encrypted? How do you manage backups if they're transmitted from a primary location to a secondary location? And also safeguarding that data in use through things like privacy, making sure that only the right people have access to the data. For example, if you're a SaaS provider and you have to do, you should not use, for example, production data in your development or test environment, right? And if you're providing support to the customer, there should be processes in place that if someone from the support organization needs to access client data, that it's done in a way that safeguards that data. Also, part of Protect is strengthening the infrastructure resilience. So is your data center protected from fire, from flood, from natural disasters? Do you have a recovery data center a certain distance away from the primary data center? So all of those things to make sure that you're in, and also the infrastructure itself. Do you have hardened images of your servers? Do you lock down all the ports? Do you delete all of the default administration passwords if those things exist? So it's all the things you do to make sure your infrastructure is resilient, including the network, the servers, the application, and then the facilities on which all of that reside. And you also have to maintain platform security. That's in the applications. And I mentioned before, things like dynamic testing, static testing, vulnerability scanning of applications. So when you're envisioning a new application, do your business requirements include security requirements? Do you take a look at a new application from a privacy perspective? So for example, will that system house medical information that might be under certain regulatory controls, such as HIPAA? Or does it maintain financial information like credit cards that would be under the PCI controls? So again, you have to also maintain the platform security. So those are the 5 categories that fall under Protect. The next is Detect. So you've identified things, you're protected. Now you have to make sure you identify any cybersecurity threats through continuous monitoring and analysis. So there's 2 categories here and 11 subcategories. So you need to continuously monitor your networks, your systems, your physical environments, your user activity, and third-party services to detect issues. Some of that might include, you have tools like in large organizations, like a security information event manager that can, bring together alerts and logs and have those analyzed. In smaller environments, somebody has to make sure that they're monitoring the logs to make sure there hasn't been any attempts to access the systems that's abnormal. But again, that's that whole process of consistently looking at the environment to see if there's anything unusual going on. Then if something unusual does occur, you need to analyze that by correlating information from multiple sources, looking at the impact and the scope, integrating threat intelligence. So, is this a 0-day event? What do we know about it? Sharing insights with the authorized teams, declaring an incident if that's appropriate. So that's all the things that happen in Detect. So basically monitoring and incident management to summarize what happens in this particular function. Then how do you respond to it? Well, there's 4 categories and 13 subcategories. You need to execute response plans. That also means you have to have response plans developed in the first place. So how do you deal with a ransomware attack? How do you deal with a breach? All of these things have to be sort of planned for, maybe tabletop exercises conducted so that your response teams are ready to deal with it. So you need to execute your response plans, triage and prioritize incidents. So what's nuisance, what's really serious, escalate those as needed, and trigger the recovery actions. It also includes investigating incidents to get to the root cause, and assessing their impact and preserve data integrity. When a security incident occurs, you need to maintain chain of custody of all of the information involved in that security incident. That'll be necessary if you need to get legal involved or law enforcement involved, you need to have all that information recorded and protected. So you basically have a chain of custody of all of the logs and all of the information that you have. So investigating those incidents, notifying and coordinating with external and external stakeholders. So there's, there could be contractual obligations to notify your customers when a breach occurs. You have to get law enforcement involved. You have to do all of those things because, especially in a serious security breach, there can be so many implications downstream. You just want to make sure everyone's informed and you have a good timeline and you're on top of things. And then you also have to, as part of respond, contain and eliminate threats to prevent further damage. A lot of times, there's one that I'm thinking of, a ransomware attack in a large healthcare organization last year. One of the things that really made that very serious is they weren't able to contain it. They were very slow on detecting, they were slow on responding, and they were very poor on containing. So multiple databases were affected through the ransomware. So again, containing and eliminating threats is a very important part of the respond function. Then we have recover. So this is comprised of 2 categories and 8 subcategories. This is where you execute your recovery plans. And again, you need to have a plan in place by prioritizing and performing restoration activities, verifying that all the backups and the assets were properly restored, and then confirming systems are back to their normal operation. So again, when you're thinking of recover, it can be very hard to recover if you didn't have good backups in the first place, right? So there's a lot that's involved here to be, from a planning perspective, to be ready to recover from a serious cybersecurity incident. You also need to coordinate and communicate recovery progress with internal and external stakeholders. And there might even be some public updates required, especially if it's, affecting, if you're the IRS, for example, the Internal Revenue Service, and you had a security breach, what types of notifications need to go out on what schedule, and making sure everybody's informed. And the last function, that's govern. So that's where you define and oversee cybersecurity risk management strategy, policy, and accountability. So this is the whole governance layer to make sure, you understand your outcomes, but people are actually on top of those outcomes. So there's 6 categories and 31 subcategories here. So you want to make sure that cybersecurity is aligned with mission, stakeholder needs, and legal requirements. So, the simple way of saying that is if you're a small business, your cybersecurity requirements, if you're a small manufacturing company, you're manufacturing, shipping widgets around the world, around the country, your cybersecurity practices may not need to be as robust as a financial services organization or a healthcare organization. So you don't want to have overkill either. So you want to align your cybersecurity with the mission, the stakeholder needs, and the legal requirements. You want to be able to define and communicate the risk appetite. So what are we willing to accept as risk, the strategy for dealing with that risk, and how we're going to prioritize our responses to those risks. You want to make sure there's clear roles and responsibilities with accountability. This really comes down to, things around the culture of your organization. It comes down to, do people have the right skill sets? Are those roles and responsibilities clearly communicated? Do the people have the tools at their disposal to perform their responsibilities? You need to establish, enforce, and update the cybersecurity policies. I mean, you could have a whole bookcase full of policies, but they're only as good as your practices, right? So you need to enforce and update those policies. And then you have to review performance to adjust your strategy and improve outcomes. And finally, and they added a big part of supply chain risk to here is making sure, from a governance perspective, you really understand your supply chain. All aspects of the service providers that help you deliver services to your customer, they have to be included. You have to have the right planning in place, the right contracts, the right oversight. So looking at function category and subcategory, I'll just break down one aspect of that just to show you how it's structured in the NIST framework. So there is a naming convention within NIST. So it starts with the function identifier. So identify has ID, respond has RS, govern has GV. So every function has an identifier. Then that's broken down into the categories. So in identify, you have 3 categories: asset management, risk assessment, and improvement. And then each of the categories can break down into the subcategories. So here in this example, we're looking at asset management. So the function is identify, the category is asset management, and the subcategories is making sure you have good hardware inventories maintained. You have software services and systems inventories maintained. You've mapped out all your network communication and data flows. So if something happens, you know what your configuration is. All your supplier service inventories are maintained, so you know who delivers services. Assets are prioritized by classification, criticality, and mission impact. Data and metadata inventories are maintained. And of course, your system, your hardware, software, and data are managed across their life cycles. So again, this is, in a high level, how this all plays out from a categorization. I'm not going to go into all of the, the identifiers for all of the outcomes. That's too much. I do have, at the end of this presentation, links to resources where you can get that information, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what the taxonomy looked like. So we have all these great outcomes. So how do you get from outcomes to actions? Well, the NIST introduced something called profiles and tiers. So let's talk a little bit about profiles and tiers right now. So a profile maps where you are today and where you want to be in terms of your cybersecurity outcomes. So for example, you have 106 outcomes. Which of the, if you could go through and say, well, and perhaps you might even determine that some of these don't apply to you, but let's just say they all do. Where are we today? Are we fully meeting a specific outcome? Are we partially meeting us? Are we not doing it at all? So where are we? And then where would we like to be? And we can basically put our target. So if we're at a partially achieved, maybe we want to move to a largely achieved in a particular outcome. And how you can guide, some of the guidance for that to help you to determine where you should be is something called tiers, because tiers reflect the maturity of how cybersecurity risk is managed and integrated with the business. Now, one of the nice things about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is there is a community around it. So there are community profiles and also predefined tiers that kind of work together to say, hey, if you're a financial services organization, here's the outcomes you should be achieving and the level of maturity and how you should achieve it. So through the profiles and tiers, you can understand where you are and where you need to be. So profiles help document an organization's current and target cybersecurity posture using the CSF outcomes. The purpose: you can tailor, assess, prioritize, and communicate your outcomes. And it can be unique to mission, stakeholders, and threats. You can actually look at a segment of your organization. Maybe you're a large company, but maybe you have maybe you're a higher learning institute, but you also have a teaching hospital. So your outcomes for the teaching hospital, because it maintains patient data and it's under the control of HIPAA, can be unique to that particular mission within your bigger company, right? So you can actually look at your profiles and your tiers, not only from company wide, but you can look at it unique to the mission and the stakeholders and the threats. So for example, does it apply to a specific area like finance? Or you can even look at a specific threat like ransomware. So these profiles, you can have multiple profiles in an organization or a single profile. This depends on the complexity and what your organization delivers in the way of services. I mentioned earlier there are community profiles. They're shared as baselines for industries or threats, and they can really help you align your security efforts with the NIST. And Those, again, are hosted on the NIST website. I have links to those community profiles later on in the presentation. And tiers reflect the maturity of how cybersecurity risk is managed and integrated with the business. So assess the rigor and effectiveness of cybersecurity risk practices. There's 4 tiers: partial, risk-informed, repeatable, adaptive, and they show an increasing level of maturity or sophistication. The key message here is tiers guide continuous improvement, not so much compliance, but they align with the maturity. They align the maturity of your cybersecurity practices with the risk appetite you're willing to take on. So tiers are more about maturity, profiles, where I am today and where do I want to be tomorrow. So let's look from profiles to tiers to resilience, because again, when I started out this presentation, I started by saying, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it because of operational resilience, right? That's the whole point. So let's look at the path, the journey. So profiles define where you are and where you want to be. Tiers show the maturity and effectiveness of your practices. And then that moves into resilience, which is the ultimate goal, requiring the right processes in place. See, that's the thing, NIST talks a lot about these outcomes, and, they're very big on saying, we're not going to tell you how. So if you want to look at NIST as the what you need to do, processes are the how you're going to do it. And to think that you can achieve those cybersecurity outcomes without the right processes in place, well, that's a mistake, because without repeatable, well-governed processes, you will never be able to achieve the outcomes, or at least sustain. You may achieve them for a point in time, but you won't be able to sustain them over time. So let's look at some of the benefits of adopting the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So it strengthens cybersecurity risk management with a structured, outcome-driven approach to managing risk. It aligns your cybersecurity with business strategy. So it really, by using outcomes which are very, which are created in a way that almost anyone can understand, it helps you connect business outcomes with critical operations. It really helps you support regulatory compliance. Because it was built using standards bodies, by using academia, by industry, by specialists, all came together to build the NIST. You can see that everything in the NIST really aligns to, it aligns to 27001, 27002. Aspects of it align to HIPAA, GDPR, all of those things you hear, all those buzzwords, all of that was taken into consideration when the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was built. It really helps enhance stakeholder communication because of the common language that's accessible to IT people, executives, and external partners. And finally, through the tiers, the profiles and the tiers, it can really help you drive continuous improvement and resilience, and help you adapt to an ever-changing risk landscape. All right, so now we're going to get into achieving operational resilience. So how do you bring all of this together to actually make your organization more resilient to cyber threats, and indirectly all threats? I mean, a robust infrastructure is a robust infrastructure, not only for cybersecurity, but for just general operations. So again, it all starts with a foundation of cybersecurity practices. So those can be informed by your NIST. I know I'm repeating this here, but this is a very important point. You have to understand what practices you need to put in place from a cybersecurity perspective. A lot of times, especially in smaller organizations, they limit their cybersecurity to technology. Oh, we got firewalls, we have two-factor authentication, we have this, we have that, and it's all tools-based. But it's the practices that are important, and the practices are informed through the NIST CSF. So you have to have the right practices in place. And then you have to have the right IT service management processes in place to basically integrate with those practices. And again, through that, you get the operational resilience. Virtually every ITSM process supports operational resilience. I mean, if you think about it, all the way from business requirements, is this application going to hold sensitive data? Through to building the application in the software development lifecycle. Do you have secure coding practices? Do you have, as you're building the application, do you have automated security testing? Do you have, dynamic and static testing of the application? All the way through to when you release it. Does your release management process take security into place? Does it factor in this? Sorry, does your release management process factor in security? Does your change management process assess the risk from a security perspective of this change going into production? All the way through to supporting. So all of the aspects, virtually every ITSM process does support operational resilience. But I think there's some processes that are more at the forefront, right? I mean, there's, if you follow the ITEL framework, there's, and I always forget, 35 or 40 processes in the new ITEL 4 framework. They all have some linkage back to security, but there's a set of processes that I think are at the forefront. And if you do those well, those are like, your basic needs. So let's start with identify. So do you have an ITSM risk management process in place? ITEL 4 talks about risk management as a service management process. It integrates with enterprise risk management, but it's a it's a subset, if you will, to manage risk within the IT environment. And do you have an IT asset management process? And that sort of extends into configuration management and service management. But again, at the core, do you have something in place that manages an asset from cradle to grave? Secure disposal of the asset. Here we have a server with data on it. It's healthcare data. How do we dispose of that asset in a secure way? Or when you purchase an asset, are you purchasing it from a reliable source? To ensure that there's nothing, on that asset that can affect you. So again, do you have the right risk management and asset management in place? And that really supports identify. Then you have protect. Well, you want to make sure change management is working well. There's a process in ITEL 4 called infrastructure management, which talks about how you manage your facility, how you manage your network infrastructure, your server infrastructure, how you manage your applications. You have to have a good release management process. In software development, the whole software development lifecycle phase, if conducted right from business requirements all the way through to, to the deployment of a release, that should have security built into it all along the way. Validation and testing, are you properly testing things from a security perspective? So I think you can see here, each of these outcomes are mapped directly to an ITSM process. Detect, well, do you have incident management? Do you have monitoring and event management? Sometimes, and I sort of, someone said to me, incident management for security is a totally different beast. Well, you have major incidents in incident management. I think, a serious security incident is in fact a major incident, and the steps of managing an incident, from detecting it to classifying it to escalating it, moving it over to problem management for root cause analysis, all those are very, very similar. Yes, there's maybe some slightly different because of containment and because of, notifying legal or law enforcement, but that's just really all part of how you respond to that specific category of incident. So detect, incident management, monitoring and event management. Are your systems well monitored, right? So do you have all those things in place? Respond, again, incident management comes to play when you respond. Problem management helps you get to root cause. And service continuity management, do you have backups of things? Do you have a recovery center? Are you able to restore the data that might have been infected by ransomware? So that's all important from a respond perspective. Does your, in service continuity management, do you have all of the proper things in place in your data center? From fire suppression to, fire detection, suppression, high availability servers, all of those things, right? Recover, again, problem management comes into play, as well as service continuity management, to go through those business continuity and disaster recovery plans. And then govern, well, if you look at it, there's two processes within ITSM: the information security management process, which is all about establishing a framework of your, they call it an information security management system, which NIST is one of. But it's about establishing an information security management system. It's making sure you have all the right policies, roles, responsibilities, and that you're putting security in at all the different areas, whether that's infrastructure, application, privacy, security awareness training, all of those. You have the right policies and practices to deal with security. And of course, you're also managing your suppliers. So have you assessed those suppliers? Have they gone through a security, so you have the right contracts in place? Do you have the ability to do third-party penetration testing of a supplier? All of that can be part of your supplier management process. So there's a direct correlation between the IT service management processes we've known and loved for years and years and years to supporting the outcomes of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It just means putting a slightly different focus on the problem, if you will. So let's take this through this mapping and look at it a little bit deeper. So let's start with NIST CSF to ITSM mapping. So let's start with the identify function, ID. That can move into risk assessment. So that's IDRA. So now we're interested in making sure we have identified one of the things, subcategories in risk assessment is identifying and recording threats. How do you do that? You need an ITSM process in place, the risk management process. And there's a specific activity and task in the risk management process which guides you to identify risks and to record them in your risk register and to assess them and prioritize them. So there's a direct correlation. The NIST tells you what you need to do, and it gives you a nice taxonomy so that you make sure you cover all the areas in the organization that need to be protected. But the process, when you map it down from an outcome to a process, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's how you operationalize delivering those outcomes of the security practice. So for example, you might have a process documented for risk management. That process can have multiple activities like establish a risk framework and culture, risk identification and assessment, risk response and mitigation, risk monitoring and reporting, and risk documentation and review. And then if you look at risk identification and assessment, there are tasks here that actually deal with that specific outcome. Not only that, but you've got the roles and responsibilities defined. So who's responsible for doing that? So an outcome, again, is very simple. We need to identify and record threats, but this gives you basically the roadmap of how you go about and do it. And that's why it's really important to make that connection. Having the NIST is great, right? But it's only going to be valuable if you're able to implement those outcomes through process. So, let's take a look at it from two perspectives. Maybe you have someone who's come in and they're looking at NIST. I mean, I was talking to one of our clients, and they mentioned that they do a regular NIST assessment. So the assessor comes in and they're very outcome focused. Do you have? And then you have the ITSM professional, they're operations focused. So the assessor basically says, have you created a patch management policy? Well, a patch management policy is great, but it's much better if it's actually executed and governed and managed. That's where an ITSM professional might come back and say, I've done one step better. I have a governed, repeatable infrastructure management process, of which one aspect of that process is creating the policies. Another aspect is governing those policies. Another aspect is implementing the tools and technology to ensure those policies are in fact being enforced. So again, same goal, but different focus, right? The assessor is looking at it at an outcome level, whereas the ITSM professional really can bring a lot of meat to it, and by operationalizing that outcome and making it easy to achieve. Same goal, different focus, but you need to have the processes in place to sustain the outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about how ITSM processes operationalize NIST CSF outcomes. So let's take that risk management process, for example. Well, the process has a description. Now, Processes are very important for a number of reasons. They institutionalize knowledge in an organization. When you bring new people on board, they can help train and inform those people of what need to be done. When everything hits the fan, it gives you step-by-step instructions on what you need to do. It can help you guide the implementation of your technology, because processes, in fact, are really there to drive user stories and technical implementation of a tool. So, if you look at a process, and a process is a lot more than just a Visio workflow of some steps. It's a description of what we're trying to do overall. It's the goals of the process. It's the objectives. What are the roles that play a part in this process? What are their, RACI values: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed? It's having a definitions of terms so that everybody is on the same page with, when you say IDP, IPS, what do we mean by that? Inputs and outputs. What do we need to perform this process? What does this process deliver? And then the actual activities, tasks, and workflow diagrams that, if you can't manage what you don't understand. And if you don't understand the process, how do you manage the process? How can you put in controls? How can you put in measurements if you don't know what the process is all about? So activities, tasks, and workflows. From there, you can derive your task descriptions and procedures for another level of detail. Then, because you understand everything, you can put the right controls, metrics, and policies in place. And then finally, you can have the user stories and technical requirements needed to implement this process in a tool. So when I talk about ITSM processes, I'm talking about a mature process that's been, well documented, defined, deployed, it's measured, and it's continually improved. So when these are in place, you have a much better chance of reaching your outcomes. So operationalizing NIST CSF through ITSM process drives operational resilience by embedding cybersecurity into daily operations. And the best part of that is you use the NIST CSF, the 6 functions, 22 categories, 106 subcategories, to inform your processes to make sure you're doing right things from a security perspective. Because I've been around the ITSM space for a long time. Maybe not all ITSM processes really are enabled with a security focus, right? So working together, you can really achieve operational resilience. And then that resilience is improved through maturity. And, we talked earlier about profiles and tiers as being part of the NIST. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about how those tiers map to process maturity. So there's different ways you can measure process maturity. You have the capability maturity model. You have something called ISO 33020. It doesn't really matter how you do it, but I'm going to use the ISO 33020 as an example. So process measurement framework for the assessment of process capability. And you have a level 1 performed. So, let's take a process like change management, right? Do I log all my changes? Well, why is that important from a security perspective? Well, I'd like to know if that reason I'm having a security problem is because of a change just got implemented. Do I log all my changes? Do they all go through some sort of risk assessment and potentially an approval if needed? Are they all tested before they're released? Are they scheduled so they don't conflict with other things and everybody knows what's going on? Their communication happens, so we know that this is going to happen. Once it's been scheduled, is it properly implemented? And then is there follow-up to close it to make sure you've checked to make sure the change went in properly? Those are all the steps of change management. Some people perform all those steps. Some people perform them inconsistently. Some people perform all those steps in one area, but not in the other area of the organization. But performed, level 1, are you at least doing the basic steps? Level 2, how will you manage those steps? So is there oversight, right? Do you manage the data? So are all change records properly managed? Do you capture the right information in the change record? Do you have a good, history of your changes? So how is the information from the process managed? Do you have a CAB meeting? Do you have management oversight of the activities? So that's managed. Then you have established. So you're performing the basic steps, you're managing them, but now you've got the process well documented, well communicated, you've got the right roles and responsibilities, you have supporting technology. that process has been rolled out to all areas of the organization, not just, some areas. So now that process is considered a level 3 of maturity because it's performed, managed, and, effectively deployed. Then you have predictable. That means you got to be measuring it, right? So what kind of analytics do you have on the process? Can you predict future performance based on past performance? And also level 5, innovation. So what do you do to continually improve that process to meet changing needs? Do you need to make it more lean, because it's become too bureaucratic? So that's innovating. So perform, manage, establish, predictable, and innovating. The NIST CSF tiers looks at it in terms of 4 levels, but that maps directly to this maturity model. So are we partially implemented? So we got some of the basic activities in place, but we're not really going much further than that. We're risk informed because we do manage the process. It's repeatable because it's well established. And then through analytics and innovation, the process becomes adaptive. So that's sort of a mapping of the NIST tiers to a capability maturity model. There's no real specific, from what I've read anyway, there's no specific assessment of maturity for NIST. They always sort of refer to other frameworks, but this is basically, this is one way you can map it, and one well-known way that's been around for a while. So here's an example from our product that looks at things through the lens of the outcomes. So within the Navvia tool itself, we have the ability to conduct cybersecurity assessments by having questions around all 106 outcomes. So you can send these questionnaires to a whole bunch of people. And in this example, you can see govern, you can see all of the categories, OC, RM, RR, PO, OV, all the way down to SC, supplier. And you can see overall, based on the responses, we have about a 45% attainment, 46% attainment. And that's measured through people responding to questionnaires, not done, partially done, largely done, fully done. Now, if you want to do this on your own some other way, that's fine. But again, are we performing the outcome? Are we partially performing the outcome? Are we largely performing the outcome? Are we fully performing the outcome? So as an example, IDAM03. So let's look at ID. Okay, so let's identify. We see overall a pretty low attainment of 37%. ID03, it's only partially attained. So right away, we know, for that specific outcome, we're about, we're somewhere around 30% attainment level. By talking to a lot of people, we've come back and we said, we're not doing everything we need to do. We're only partially doing it. I think and if you deem that's an important thing, you can improve it. Now, why would that thing be important? Because without clear network and data flow maps, your organization is blind to its digital infrastructure, hindering risk management. So how do I protect it if I don't understand what the infrastructure looks like? How do I respond to an incident if I don't understand what the infrastructure looks like? And how do I put continuity in place if I haven't gone through all of the steps of assessing the potential risks and putting the right treatments in place to address those risks? So again, you can see a direct correlation here between IDAM03 and how it actually affects your organization. So you can look at the NIST outcomes. So that's somebody's asking those questions like, show me your data flow maps. Last updated, 2022. Are those current? So you base your response. The assessor, or if you do a self-assessment, can base those responses on looking at some of that evidence. But now we also want to look at the IT service management process. So looking at it through the lens of a maturity model, level 1 through 5. And if I look at asset, so I've got, different levels of maturity here. And if I look at asset management, I'm only partially performing the basic activities of the process. So right away, I'm hindered. And if you look across the whole aspects, I'm only partially performing. I'm dealing with the information from the process. I'm really not doing anything around performance management, process assurance, or process definition. I supposedly deployed the process, but there's nothing defined. So again, you can take that with a grain of salt, but all together, this process scored very low, which correlates back to that outcome. If you haven't got a good asset management process in place, you're not going to be able to support the identify function of NIST. And you can actually look at this through the lens of different groups in the organization, right? So you can take a look at all of the information. So let's say I went out and I did a self-assessment, let's say, of the NIST framework, and I'm only looking at the category level now, right? So I've got, a 43% for govern, partially across the board. So, we haven't really it looks like we haven't got the right oversight in place. We've maybe through heroic efforts, we've been able to largely implement, identify, protect, respond, and recover. But, we still have a lot of work to do in govern. So that's basically a roll up of all of the responses. And when I talk about groups, it's really important when you're going out to speak to people about NIST outcomes, you're going out to speak to them from different perspectives. What does audit say? What does the internal audit people say? What do the ITSM people say? What does the InfoSec people say? What does management say? So what did the service owners say about these aspects? So by bringing all those perspectives together, you can get sort of an overall score. But then if you sort of pull out the service management office, you'll notice that, on protect, they rated things much higher. They also, detect a little higher than, 29 versus 49. So you can see there's a gap. And when you look at things from this perspective, you can really see that in this case, the service management office has a higher attainment and recovery and governance compared to the overall organization. So identifying these gaps can help you uncover potential issues in training, communication, or process execution within departments. I mean, this just reminds me of a story, going back to one of my first consulting gigs way back in the day. And I'm sitting in a workshop and I asked the question, it was about, I can't remember the process right now, but it was about a specific process. And I basically asked the question, how well is the process documented? And there was, 15 people in the room. And I said, who thinks it's extremely well documented, like a level 5, you've documenting it, you review it, you improve it. And, half the room put their hand up, said, yep, we're a level 5. We're doing a great job. The other half of the room sort of looks at them and said, what's going on? I don't know you have a process. I've never seen this process. No one has told me about this process. So identifying the gaps between the departments, you might, the service management office might think they're walking on water, but the other departments have a completely different view. And some of that could be as simple as communication, training, and, just getting the word out. So another way you can look at things here is through the lens of different groups, both for maturity and for the attainment of the NIST outcomes. So it's really important if you're looking to achieve those NIST outcomes. Now, we all know, and I didn't start this presentation talking about how important security is. We all know security is really important, right? We all know that, maybe we all don't know, maybe we don't all know this, but $10 trillion is going to be the cost of cybersecurity incidents in 2025 is the estimation. IBM says it's around $5 million per cybersecurity breach. The cost of cybersecurity, not only financial, but to your reputation, is really, really important. Take a look at, there's 2 high profile ones, the CrowdStrike. Now, CrowdStrike's interesting. It wasn't exactly a security breach, but it was a deployment of a change to their software, which is part of the security infrastructure. And that change caused the servers that they ran on to go basically blue screen, if you're familiar with that term from a Windows Server perspective. And if those of you who want to, if you want to just a reminder, this is that time that it affected a lot of reservation systems. So this specific software from CrowdStrike was inside reservation system software as a piece of security, and it brought like a lot of airlines to their needs. The costs are in the billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars to the industry. And, CrowdStrike really went through some pain because of it, reputational wise, financially. They're being sued. A similar thing happened to United Healthcare, where ransomware wasn't well contained, it spread through the organization. They're talking of that overall cost being in the billions of dollars. So, this stuff is serious, right? And the NIST does a great job of telling you what you're going to do, but it's not meant to be a checklist, right? You just can't check that list and say, yeah, I have an asset management inventory. You got to make sure that inventory is managed. Oh yeah, I do network monitoring. Oh yeah, well, did someone monitor that new application you put on board? Did that go through the right process to actually get monitored? Things don't magically get monitored. Or are those logs that you're collecting, is somebody actually reviewing those logs, whether it's, an AI or whether it's a security specialist, but something's got to be, I wrote a blog post where I talked about, think of yourself as James Bond trying to infiltrate, some facility, right? And, it's got motion detectors and it's got, electrified fences and it's got cameras and all of this stuff. But if no one's looking at the cameras, if no one's looking at the monitor, no one's monitoring things, that all that technology you put in place is useless. And the only way you can ensure that's in place is through an ongoing assessment of both NIST outcomes and ITSM process. That's essential for operational resilience. And the bonus is you're not only protecting yourself from cybersecurity incidents, you're protecting yourself from all types of threats. This could be it could be a fire, it could be, an earthquake, it could be, it's not only focused on cybersecurity, it could be, releasing a bad change into production. Operational resilience really requires an ongoing assessment of NIST outcomes and ITSM processes. And we're not talking about pen tests here or vulnerability scans. All those are subsets of the ITSM process, right? People say, oh, I'm fine. I do a pen test once a year, or I do a pen test twice a year. Those are artifacts that are part of the process. Are you really performing the process? That's more important. So for example, if I did a pen test and I found 3 deficiencies, did I log those deficiencies somewhere? Did I assign them to development? Am I tracking them through to the end? Again, without the process, a lot of this technology it doesn't really deliver. And that's proven by the fact that, there's never been more awareness about cybersecurity and the breaches keep coming, right? So ongoing assessment of NIST outcomes and ITS processes are essential. So NIST CSF defines the outcomes required for effective cybersecurity risk management. ITSM processes operationalize these outcomes into sustainable, repeatable actions. The better your process maturity, the better your consistency and your ability to adapt to an ever-evolving threat landscape. And ongoing assessments drive continuous improvement to adapt to emerging threats. Okay, let's talk a little bit. We're pretty close to the end of the presentation. Let's talk a little bit about extending the value of the NIST CSF. So the beauty of NIST, because it was designed in collaboration with all of these different stakeholder groups, specialists from government, from industry, different sectors, from the different standards bodies, it does really naturally align. And there's actually some good mapping information available where you can see how the NIST CSF aligns. So if you're looking at the NIST CSF outcomes, you're actually looking at the outcomes for the other frameworks as well. It strengthens enterprise risk management. So we've been talking about IT risk management here, but enterprise risk management is also concerned about the overall risk to the business. And this helps you integrate cybersecurity into the overall risk portfolios. It bridges the cybersecurity and business goals because we're talking about things in business terms. It links these technical activities to a language that's a little more business-like, a little more strategic, which can help improve governance and accountability. If someone in legal understands the NIST outcomes, they can start asking the right questions to the IT infrastructure people. Are we protected from these? And of course, it actually helps you enhance your existing ITSM processes because, like I said, over the years, people perform, incident management, problem management, change management, but are you doing it? Do you have the right aspects of security built into those processes? So again, it could really help enhance your ITSM processes. You can leverage, there's something called the NIST 800 series. So the NIST looks at NIST Cybersecurity Framework, looks at outcomes. But if you really want some implementation guidance, you want to get into the 800 series. So if you want to map outcomes, so if you want to apply security and privacy controls to support NIST CSF, you want to look at NIST 800-53. If you want to do a better job of risk assessment, like specifically on a tech, like what are the steps, the implementation steps, look at NIST 800-30. For incident response, NIST 800-61 gives a lot of great guidance for incident handling. There's something called the NIST Risk Management Framework, and you can really help integrate that into the cybersecurity framework through NIST 800-37. And also, if you're concerned about privacy, protecting personally identifiable information, you can look at something like NIST 800-122. And again, you can always refer back to this presentation. We will be providing a recording and the slides, but you can also support governance of this whole overall framework with NIST 800-160. NIST does a great job of facilitating communication so that, I'm repeating some of the important points here. Common language for all stakeholders. This is probably the most important aspect. It bridges that gap between technical teams, executives, and boards. It supports risk-based decision-making because now you can, with all of those outcomes, you can help assess, prioritize the risk, determine how you're going to treat those risks. It improves external communication because we have a common language. We can align better with our customers, the regulators, partners. And also it helps you with executive level reporting. Some of those heat maps I showed you earlier can really simplify presenting cybersecurity posture and maturity in business terms. The business value of the NIST, it integrates cybersecurity into enterprise risk management. It helps align risk reduction with strategic business goals. It strengthens compliance and audit readiness. Hey, I've always said this to, from an ITSM perspective, I've been saying this for years. Why don't you design your processes to support what the auditors are looking for? Because you're going to have a lot better chance of, meeting their requirements. Why don't you bring them into the conversation when you're designing the process? Well, if you bring the auditors into the conversation, break down the silos between governance, risk, and compliance, between InfoSec and between ITSM, when you break down those barriers, it's actually going to strengthen compliance and audit readiness. It improves communication and transparency with the boards, customers, and other partners. And it also enables continuous improvement and operational resilience by supporting really adaptable, sustainable cybersecurity practices. Some additional resources you might want to look into. So and again, all these are hyperlinks, are going to be in the presentation. You can get all of the official documentation at NIST.gov, Cybersecurity Framework, or Cyber Framework, I should say. You can get the profiles and tiers and guidance on those. There's quick start guides that can help you get started with NIST. So there's the link to those. There's also sample community profiles and case studies, which you might be able to align to your business. We also have a lot of security resources on our website. If you go to navvia.com/resources, Navvia also offers a cybersecurity assessment capability within our product, where we've taken all of the NIST functions and created detailed questionnaires and comprehensive reports, as well as process maturity from a security perspective, again, for the processes that align to the NIST functions. So you can check that out on our cybersecurity link. We also do have some advanced NIST training available through our partner, the DVMS Institute. So if you go to navvia.com NIST-training, you can get access to foundation and practitioner levels of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework training. Speaking of our partner, the DVMS Institute, these guys do a great job on focusing on digital value and resilience, and they help organizations through education, training, and their intellectual property, manage cybersecurity risks to protect business value and operational continuity. They also very much align with frameworks. They're one of the leading NIST training providers, so they're a great resource that can really help you get professional certifications and get access to resources that can advance cybersecurity resilience, improve your career, and also help with business risk management. So those are some additional resources to look at. Key takeaways from the presentation. NIST CSF provides a proven framework to manage and reduce cybersecurity risks. It defines all the outcomes you need to address. It's outcome driven and flexible. So, like I said, if I had a good process, I can maintain my inventory through Visio if I'm a small company. And I have my inventory and I have my configuration and I have my data flow. And I've met the outcome. And I'm going to have a repeatable process to update it on a regular basis and make sure it's accurate. And if I change something, make sure I update it. And it goes all the way up to the largest enterprise who does the same thing, but with much more sophistication, auto discovery tools and configuration management, CMDB, all that kind of stuff. So because it's outcome driven and flexible, it integrates easily with existing cybersecurity programs and it's very scalable. Operational resilience, I'm telling you, depends upon mature ITSM processes aligned to those security outcomes, because everything in IT runs through the ITSM processes. So how are you going to safeguard your security, your IT security, if you're not doing it through your ITSM processes? It's a natural connection. And continuous improvement and clear communication is essential to staying resilient and adaptive. So this is, I think, the last slide before the questions. So this is a funny one. I showed my presentation to my wife because she's an executive. She often gives me good advice. And she says, oh no, everybody wants a 30-day plan. Everybody wants a 30-day plan. And I said, yeah, but how realistic really in most organizations to do anything in 30 days? It takes you 30 days to get the meeting with your sponsor. But anyway, whether you look at this as a 30-day plan, 90-day plan, or 180-day plan, this is more some of the things you should probably think about doing. Do discovery, engage your stakeholders across cybersecurity, ITSM, and the GRC group. Baseline your current posture using the CSF functions. And then maybe from those CSF functions, select a priority area like asset management or incident response to focus your efforts. Then go deeper and assess those outcomes and assess those processes that you're focusing on through tools like the Navvia tool or doing it yourself, or however you want to approach that, but mapping the relevant CSF outcomes to supporting ITSM processes, looking at your maturity, and then you can use that to define your current and target profiles. And once you understand your current and target profiles, well, then you can set and prioritize how you're going to address it. So look at the biggest impact on resilience. Some of those heat maps really point out where the gaps are. Launch some improvement initiatives, perhaps small targeted ones. Maybe you want to focus on process updates or role alignment or training, and then establish a cadence to do regular reviews and updates and continual improvement across the whole board. So just some things you might want to consider of how you can take the NIST CSF and make it actionable in your organization.